That wasn't life. Okay, so life without architecture. It would be somewhat of a anti-Renaissance in the fact that if you would consider the Renaissance a new beginning, life without it would be restart from the very beginning, because when we stopped being nomads, we started building buildings, and that was something somewhat of a start to architecture and a start of civilization at the same time. Um, and if you kind of consider philosophy to be when we started having time to think about life, that can also be a start of philosophy as well. When architecture started, philosophy did as well. We live our lives out in memory factories in the sense the buildings that we live in produce what we know and what we think, what we respond to. Most of us, almost all of us, I would say, grew up in some sort of enclosed dwelling, and we can call that home. Today's most contemporary philosophy, called speculative realism, as explained by Todd Gannon in Log 33, says, it aims to reinvigorate our discussions of human-world relationships and argue for the re-inclusion of objects in our discourse in order to retain wonder, mystery, surprise, and power. Speculative realism also goes by the name of triple O, or object-oriented ontology. The basic understanding of philosophical history is also an understanding of our built environment. I'm going to overview some very general and major questions that have been occurred to us since the beginning of time with the pre-Socratic Greeks, and after Socrates started asking big questions, they're called the post-Socratic Greeks. Let's start with the basics. One of the biggest questions is, what is real? And we have two areas of thought on this. There's idealism and realism. Idealism was kind of started with George Berkeley, and he said, nothing exists beyond my mind. I process everything through my mind, and I can't prove for a fact that anything else but what I sense is real. And that was continued by Descartes in his famous Meditations, where he thought, cogito ergo sum, which in Latin means, I think therefore I am. That's what we know very well. And this is countered by realism, which says, actually, we can rely on our senses to posit something beyond our minds, and there's actually something out there. That's what most of us would agree with. I can probably, by a raise of hands, who is an idealist? Who thinks that there's nothing beyond our minds? Yeah, and that's what's generally accepted as truth. After we spend a lot of time trying to think what's real, most of us will get to the point, okay, well, let's just assume everything's real. There's stuff beyond our minds. What constitutes it? And there's lots of questions lots of ways to answer that. Graham Harman talks about in his book called The Quadruple Object about a handful of different theories. He talks about Thales of Turkey, who said everything's made out of water, and this was way back 2,000 years ago. And someone at the same time said everything's made out of air, and that was like kind of the most advanced thinking at the time because no one else really had thought about that yet. Okay, it's all air. And then someone else named Anaximenes of Greece said that everything was a mixture of water, earth, air, and fire mixed with love and separated by hate, and that was a bit more advanced. And the next guy, his name is Democritus. These are all kind of in 100-year increments. Democritus said that there's a basic element called atoms that kind of bond everything together, and that's what we believe today, and that was very lucky of him, and he got that right. We understand that to be real after modern science has proved it. So there's one way, that's reducing it to parts, and there's another way to look at objects, and that is overmining it, which is to consider it as just relationships. And this is a bit more visible in architecture because we can see architects and theoreticians saying, oh, architecture is just the relationship of people to the environments, or it's just the relationship of economy to efficiency, or sustainability and efficiency. That's a bit more easy to wrap our minds around. I mean, you could say it's just bricks, but that doesn't really have much substance to it. Harman speaks of philosophers named Whitehead and Latour in Quadruple Object, again, who claim that reality is simply the relationship between things. So there's some basis for that. They see rain hitting a window not as rain plus window, but as the relationship between rain and window. More recently, in Log 33, which is another book I referenced, Mark Gage talks about how he as quotes, this happens when we say architecture is no more than its social and cultural implications, or how it reduces itself to simply environmental machines capable of sustaining energy and energy efficiency. So how does this relate all to architecture? I mentioned it a few times, but all these things have implications laid out into a book called Toward the Speculative Realism. Graham Harman lays out a critique that says, in the face of the looming ecological catastrophe and the increasing infiltration of technology into the everyday world, it is not clear that the anti-realist position is equipped to face up to these developments. So he's saying we really need to have realism in philosophy today if we really want to combat what's important. If you look at partnerships between architects and philosophers, there's a French philosopher named Derrida who was really good friends with a guy named Peter Eisenman. And Derrida was all about language being the basis for everything. If you know an architect named Daniel Libeskind, he really likes that. When he actually came to Ball State last year, and or two years ago, and he said, architecture is language. And it seems really poetic, but if you look at his buildings, you'll see that, for example, the Berlin Museum the Holocaust Museum in Berlin, he's trying to make you uncomfortable. So architecture is discomfort, or it's reflection, and that's he uses a basis of metaphors, and that's kind of based off of Derrida's writing. Deleuze and the 90s digital architects were really interested in processes and flows, and the reason that the 90s digital architects like that is because they can now imitate flows on the computer. So they read a lot of the things at that time. And there's been a long history of philosophers and architects, sometimes architect philosophers, and all that shapes the most representative architecture of that age. Then when I talked about Graham Harman, he's a very contemporary philosopher, and what he's interested in is distinct realities, because whereas Derrida and Deleuze were really interested in idealism, where it doesn't matter what's out there, what matters is in the mind, Harman's more interested in what things are without our minds. So basically, to wrap this up, this speech was all about navigating our world with trying to go through it with an understanding of the thought that's behind what's erected. It'll give some more enriched interaction with man-made places by analyzing big questions such as what is real and like what constitute things, what are the direct relationships between part and whole. We can better understand why things are the way they are and what the big thinkers were thinking. The people who had to go through all these years of schooling, not just to produce boxes, but to produce ideas. As we face a looming over-economization and a reduction to lesser elements in architecture, it's now more than ever that it's important to base our random formal, tendencies on philosophical thought and reasoning and logic. So, thank you.